Welcome back. So what options does the United States have to help Ukraine beyond sanctions and sending military equipment? What happens if the war, by accident or design, spreads to NATO countries? How likely is it that Vladimir Putin's designs end with Ukraine? We brought together three experts to discuss the war and its implications. Kori, Senior Fellow and Director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Cyber expert Clint, Distinguished Research Fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And from Stanford, the former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, McFaul. Kori, let me start with you and this. First of all, we're sending all this military aid, we're sending all this equipment to a country in the middle of a war. Just logistically, is it realistic that we're going to be able to get all these arms to the Ukrainians?
Sure, the Ukrainians are in control of most of their own borders, and taking it up to the border and handing it over to Ukrainians willing and able to fight for their country is what's already going on. Several NATO countries are already convoying military equipment to the Ukrainians.
The next step here for us in the next week or two, should we expect more troops to be sent to NATO countries in the Eastern Europe?
Well, we're sending a lot of troops to NATO countries. The NATO reaction force has already been sent as well. These are good things, reminding the Russians that we're prepared to defend ourselves and defend our allies is a stabilizing message right now.
Clint, we brought you here. I think there's a lot of us, and I'm curious, that are surprised we haven't seen a cyber attack against the United States yet, or against the West. What are you seeing in your research?
It's an onion, right? If you look at the core, Ukrainians under cyber attack for 8 years, and it's been intense. There are some reports of some destructive malware. You might have seen DHS CISA put out some warnings about that, so we need to ratchet up. I think this really speaks to the point about what are we going to do for a cyber response. We have been delinquent on coming up with a solution on this for the last decade. And we've been talking about NATO. What is a cyber NATO? Attack on one, is it an attack on all? It's time to figure those things out so we have a unified response.
Earlier this week, there were some reports that President Biden has been given at least the options of potentially using offensive cyber capabilities against Russia. How likely is that going to happen, or was that probably designed to saber rattle Russia a little bit?
I think it's some of both. I mean, it's good to have these things in our pocket, but it's also time to set that deterrence. There are two aspects to this war, really three, that Putin can use: nuclear, cyber, and disinformation, misinformation, to really put us on our heels and destabilize us. So if we can keep it limited, we can use it in scope, and we go off of specific targets. Maybe it's the military, maybe it's parts of Russia, maybe it's certain parts of the banking system to send a message. I think we need to figure out that there's something between absolute destruction of our cyberspace and not doing anything at all.
Ambassador McFaul, let's go to another way that this could end, and that is if Putin either recalculates, and maybe that's what these peace talks are about, or, as Admiral Stavridis said to me in my podcast, there's a Julius Caesar solution. What do you see right now with Putin, and do you think he's a rational actor right now?
You know, Chuck, that word rational actor is a very elastic, right? To get kicked out of SWIFT, as it happened to Russia yesterday, and then to have the president of Russia get in front of his generals and say we need to prepare for a nuclear war, that doesn't sound very rational to me. I'm nervous that Mr. Putin has been believing his propaganda for decades. Remember, this guy's been in power for 22 years. He doesn't listen to his aides. Even when I was ambassador 8 years ago, he was very dismissive of anybody around him. He's out at his compound, doesn't come into town very much, and under COVID, he's been more isolated. And if you watch and listen to him, and I met him in 1991, I've been watching him since he was prime minister in 1999. I sat in the room with him for 5 years when I worked in the Obama administration. I speak Russian, I listen to him, and I know what he says. He's increasingly unhinged in the way that he talks about the regime. Just yesterday, talking about Zelensky being a neo-Nazi. Let's remind everybody watching, he's Jewish, and a drug addict. That doesn't sound like somebody that's going to sit down and negotiate a peaceful outcome.
So if that's the case, then how do you create policy if you know he's an irrational actor?
Well, one, deterrence, of course. We need to be vigilant. This nuclear threat especially, I think we need to respond to. I would hope that General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, would be calling his counterpart today, Mr. Gerasimov, to clarify exactly what he meant by those statements. Number two, I think this is about the war. You know, yeah, the sanctions are great. I support them 100%, but they take months and years to have effect. Yeah. It's really about winning the war on the ground. We need to support the Ukrainians who are fighting. And three, if he succeeds in his ultimate objective, which is regime change, and force Zelensky out of power, arrest him, or kill him, we need to continue to support the resistance. I'm convinced, Chuck, there is no way that Ukrainians will submit to some kind of puppet regime from Russia. That is not going to happen. But to unravel that could take a long time.
Look, they've twice gotten rid of puppet regimes. Kori, it's been fascinating waking up every morning, seeing Zelensky alive and thriving. And you can see the Western alliance having the same feeling, going, we should do more. We should have done more. I get the sense now there's a lot of regret in Europe.
Well, all of us should have done more for the protection and defense of Ukraine. But now what Putin is trying to do, in part with this nuclear threat, is collapse Western solidarity. What he wanted was to end the post-Cold War order, and he's rejuvenated it. NATO's
never felt more relevant.
It's a delight to behold that Western countries are standing strong and squaring their shoulders together.
What do you expect our official response to be to this nuclear saber rattling by Putin?
I hope it will be the response that the French foreign minister gave, which is that we too have nuclear weapons, and we too are prepared to defend ourselves, our allies, and our interests.
Clint, should Americans expect that we're going to get attacked by the Russians? On cyber, cyber in some form?
I think so, in some form. But I also think Americans need to learn that they can go without Netflix for an hour and we will be okay. We don't have resilience in this country around cyber. And I think the same part with the administration. We keep saying Putin is playing chess. He is not. He's playing poker. We need to call his bluff. If the Ukrainians can hold for another week, the supply lines are not there. He cannot stabilize his rear areas. We have a real chance to stop Putin in his tracks and give him a decisive loss.
We do. Well, go get him, President Zelensky. Hey, thank you, guys. Really appreciate it. Mike, Kori, Clint, very good stuff.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.